Thank y'all. Okay, recording in progress. Thank y'all so much for being here at Sojourn's Pathway to Progress speaker series. This is the second in a series of 6 Zoom panels that we're doing. And we're super excited to have y'all. This is a series dedicated to, bringing amazing minds and thought leaders and resources, both to the people present here and also to folks sort of in perpetuity to have as a resource. So that's why we're recording today. And if you haven't seen my face or heard my voice before, hello, my name is Rose, and I am Sojourn's Communications and Legislative Affairs Coordinator. I use they, them pronouns, and today I will be moderating this panel with the incredible Joy Ladin and Liam Hooper. And before we get started, we wanted to thank the sponsor for the Pathways to Progress series, the Bremen Foundation. Very, very grateful for that support. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and introduce our incredible panelists and get started. So we're going to start with Dr. Joy Ladin. She is a nationally recognized speaker on trans and Jewish identity. After her transition at Yeshiva University made her the first openly transgender employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution. And she's the author of the National Jewish Book Award finalist, Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders. She's a Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist. She's also wrote a book called The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. And she's also written 9 books of poetry. So we're very excited to have her here with us. And we also have the incredible Liam Hooper. He is an author, gender theorist, theological activist, trans activist and advocate, a public speaker and an educator, sometimes a podcaster, and most of all, he's a co-curator of Courageous Conversations. He works widely as a conversation convener, a workshop and seminar facilitator, and participant co-creator of learning communities, small and large. And he's currently the assistant director of the Wild Acres Leadership Initiative and a 2020-2022 fellow of the William C. Friday Fellowship for Human Relations. So Joy and Liam, welcome. And to start off, I would love it if you could just answer for us a little bit about what you love about Judaism, what about Judaism speaks to you as a trans person, and what do you think trans people have to offer Jewish thought and teaching and spaces? I feel like that's a good question to start us off and let everybody get to know y'all a little bit.
That is 3 good questions. Can we take those one at a time? Because those are all really good questions. Liam, do you want to start?
I think I can enjoy what you might have to say, and we can begin with you, and I can jump in, unless you just would like to see what kind of weirdness I come up with.
Yeah, I'd like to see what kind of weirdness you come up with. Because I think you speak very eloquently about what you love about Judaism.
Okay, thank you, Joy. So, I've actually given this a lot of thought, and I think on one level, it's almost easier to ask me what I don't love about Judaism, which Joy probably really appreciates. But because Joy accompanied me to my great benefit through my conversion process. And I think as a convert, I have sort of a unique experience, and particularly as a person who came to Judaism through Christian, like I went into Christian seminary and came out a Jew. And I think that gives me an unusual, but maybe robust perspective. And I think because Judaism to me, just from its beginning and its ongoing sort of Lador Vador, right? Like this continuous unfolding generation to generation is both textual, like it's embedded in these teachings and these stories and these mitzvot that we hold so dear. And then the commentaries, right? The written and the oral Torah, and the commentaries on the commentaries, which are continuing in this ever expanding banquet that is contemporary Judaism. And at the core of all that, though, for me, obviously, is Torah writ large, the whole of it, which this is part of in my mind. And this embeddedness in community, by which I mean that Judaism and peoplehood are intimately bound together. And that is like, can be both a place of disappointment, but also of bounty, right? And connectedness and healing. And in that, there's this sort of recognition that is embedded in our stories, in our traditions, in our ritual practice, in our ways of worship, and certainly in the idea of chavruta, right, of study, that Judaism is both individual and communal practice, and neither thing can be divided from the other. And so we're all not only interconnected and interdependent, but mutually interaccountable and responsible to the mitzvot and to one another, and to some apprehension of a measure of tikkun olam in our own time. And that, I can't say enough about, like, I could talk like we could have a whole day long workshop about, what does all that mean? And for me, embedded in that are these marvelously illustrative stories of the innate diversity, and I would posit, the wholly diverse particularity of humanity in all the stories. And, as a person raised predominantly in the South, but in Christendom in particular, the fact that we don't just lift up like one human being who, like in Christendom, then becomes God, which is a whole other conversation. But we don't just lift up like one teacher. And for lesser teachers that come out as the Gospels, which I'm not throwing shade on, I'm making a observation. We have Abraham and Sarah, and we have Moshe and Miriam, and we have like this holy host of people who have discerned the voice of God and discerned Torah, and given to us an example of ourselves as humanity, right, as human beings, all through the continuum, which to me says we all belong, right? Like, even me, and my people, even the most queer and weird and strange and unusual among us belong. And as if the rabbis understood that, then we get this marvelous tradition, which I have been embracing lately in my own practice since my mother's death, this idea of saying 100 blessings a day. And in that, two of them are about what we say in blessing when we see beautiful things or when we see unusual creatures. And to me, that lifts up this embedded, intrinsic, and marvelous diversity or innate particularity of personhood that runs through all of Judaism, even down to, different denominations and this spattering of cultures and influences through the diaspora. In the midst of this set apartness as a people, there's this unity that takes us all in. And I find that to be a really profound contrast to what I grew up with here in the South.
Well, as usual, Liam, I listen to you and I tend to want to just respond by saying what he said. So definitely what he said. In terms of my own personal, what I love about Judaism, the main things that come to mind are, first of all, I really love the whole God thing. And I love that God in Judaism does not have a body and does not make sense and refuses to make sense in human terms. That was a really important uh, example. Actually made God kind of the only role model I had as a queer person when I was growing up, because I didn't make sense in the terms of the human beings around me. And here, the star of the Torah, the center of Judaism, is a being who we're instructed to always remember it doesn't make sense in human terms. I also love that that's not enough, that we're supposed to relate to that being who doesn't make sense, right? That being wants a relationship with human beings, and human beings are supposed to be in relationship, really reciprocal relationship. We're supposed to do stuff for God. God does stuff for us. It's a long-term commitment thing. These are real relationships. Another thing that I've loved is how much complaining there is in Jewish tradition, because I was always kvetchy. But it encompasses the whole act. These are real relationships that we're supposed to have with God. And again, as a trans person who felt incomprehensible in human terms, it was really something that took me decades to really take in, this idea that God is like, yeah, absolutely, I'm going to be here in ways that you will never understand. And I expect you to relate to me. Like, that's the deal. Relate to me as I am. And so I love those aspects of Judaism. I love that Judaism also emphasizes the holiness of our relations to one another. I love that, there's a lot of ways of seeing, I mean, people who don't like Jewish tradition will often look at all the commandments in the Torah, which frankly, I don't find the most interesting parts of the Torah either. But it's like, what a petty idea of God, that God cares about all this tiny stuff. But to me, it's extraordinary that the God we're told created everything is paying so much attention to human beings, in particular, how we treat one another. That the idea that God feels that our relationship to God can be reflected in these tiny, tiny details of our own lives, I think is beautiful and moving. And the prophets coming along and saying, what really makes God sick about you? And it's not those petty details, not the fringes on your garments. It's how you're treating poor people. It's how you know, are you cheating? Are you stealing? Are you defrauding one another? It's what we would call institutionalized oppression. And that God suffers from our institutionalized oppression of one another, I think is extraordinary. Um, and then I love the Torah. It's not like the most fun read, but I love it in and of itself. I can't stop reading it. And I think part of that is a thing that Judaism does, which I think is extremely brave, which is it says that human interpretation is holy. It's not just holy to interpret the Torah, but that human interpretations of the Torah grow the Torah, that the Torah extends through that they add to the holiness of the Torah. This makes Judaism, there are fundamentalist forms of Judaism, but the rabbinic tradition by making interpretation so central to it, it's really an anti-fundamentalist.
I think that
Indeed.
that makes a lot of sense. And thank you both for sharing that. I've related both to pieces of, Judaism speaking as an individual trans person and also speaking to how we are in community and how we should relate to other people. It's something that's both individual and collective.
Is it okay if I just say also ditto what Joy said, right? But also, when you were talking, Joy, it made me think about one of our earliest conversations. I think it was when Peterson and I invited you to the podcast. Anyway, we were talking about this whole God thing, you know, that is the sort of center of Judaism. But through Genesis 1 and 2, where the creation of community, of relationship, is the primary thing. And in response to this, or as part of that, when these two first human creatures kind of wander off and do things they weren't supposed to do, God comes to them physically in the garden in the breezy time of day, you know, saying, "Where are you?" And so, in this sort of community that God has posited us into, right? Like put us into, there's God is always seeking us. And therefore we should seek each other, right? Like to me, all these things are packed in there, and you can take once you learn to read the text in its language, not through your own so much, you know, even though we do that anyway, but read it in the Hebrew. There's so many places where you can glean from one sentence something about how we're supposed to act together, and that is why we have this whole Torah.
So, given all of this, juicy source material that we have, um, or even sort of despite that, there's a lot of barriers to trans folks within Jewish community, Jewish life, being involved in Jewish communities. I was wondering what y'all see as those barriers, and what do you think organized Jewish communities could be doing to include trans folks in ritual life and in community life?
Well, I think that one of the radical ideas, Judaism didn't exist. The Torah didn't create Judaism. That grows over millennia. But one of the radical ideas in the Torah is the idea of sacred community. So the idea that the sacred people are not just this priestly elite doing mysterious things with one another and with deities, or maybe throw in a pharaoh or a king or two, but that actually, as the Torah says over and over again, the entire people is holy. The entire people are priests. What everybody individually does should, like a priest, reflect this holy relationship with God. It's an extremely powerful and moving idea. And one of the, and it's an idea that has some serious downsides, because the power of it, from God's point of view, the power of it is human communities, they're self-sustaining. Like, I can imagine God looking at human communities and saying, well, if I want to be visible through human communities, I need to make relation to me just part of what people do routinely. People are always relating to each other in the same ways over and over, same etiquette, same rituals, conventions, right? If I can get in there and make these rituals and conventions and routinized ways of relating to one another, if I can make them reflections of me, of their relationship with me, then the whole people in their daily lives will be living lives that reflect their relationship with me. Easy peasy, no problem. However, and this is, kind of, to me, says that indeed maybe this idea what did not come from a human being. As we know, human communities can't readily distinguish what we're used to from what's good, right? So for human communities, what's good tends to be what we're used to. And even the stuff that we're used to that's not good, we tend to be afraid of changing, right? We're afraid that whatever comes next will be worse, or we have some investments in it. Everybody has investments in the ways community works. So this community is holy idea, as it gets worked out in Jewish history, it tends not to be great for people who are different in various kinds of ways, right? Because not so much because God is normative. What Liam was saying about, and Liam writes wonderfully about diversity of creation, and that really reflects what God likes about creation is the diversity, it's the mixture. But human communities work by assigning people roles and identities and knowing who people are in relation to one another. It grows out of our history of being small community, small clans where everybody had to do their role. Otherwise, the whole group was going to fall apart, right? So we didn't. So there's good reasons for it, but it tends to make people who are different um, make it hard for them to fit into very normative communities. And so I think that it readily became confusing, and it is even today confusing to tell what is holy about a Jewish community, the way like a synagogue does things, as opposed to just this is the way that people are accustomed to. And in fact, at least one rabbi made it explicit. He ejected somebody with Tourette's syndrome. And when somebody else protested and said, there is nothing in Jewish tradition that says you can't have Tourette's syndrome and be in, he said, look, anything that disturbs communal worship is getting in the way of the avodah, of the work of the community. This is holy work when we pray together. And there's a lot of things, a lot of the barriers to queer people in Jewish communities just have to do with non-queer people being uncomfortable, feeling disturbed, feeling like, well, if you're here and you're visibly different, that means we just have to pay attention to you instead of doing the stuff that we come together in this community to do. And that doesn't have anything to do with God. That is just the way people are.
Yeah, I think every time you and I talk, or I hear you talk, Joy, I want to start taking notes because I'm like, oh, I'm going to forget that by dinner time. But in that way, it's also part of, even in our need to define these relationships we're in and who's doing what, and the just nature of human community building. There's also the reality that humans are bent on discernment of difference, right? Like we need to know when fangs are friendly, like a dog, and when they're foe, like a copperhead, right? Or what berries we can eat and which ones we can't, and where the water is safe to drink and where it's, like we have to discriminate. And learning, I think, to find ways to move beyond our own experience and our own sense of what we think we know and see who's all around us and who's beside us and who's behind us and see them as beautiful, perhaps unusual creatures like us, right? That, to appreciate human particularity is a very difficult thing to do in larger and larger and increasingly larger human communities that just become more and more removed from what community can be and perhaps once was when we were smaller, and so when we get stuck in differentiation we can at the same time forget that a whole world of human diversity is built into our tradition. It's built into our Torah. It's built into our stories. It's built into the whole of what Judaism is. And I think most queer folks and certainly most trans folks have no idea that there are people in these stories analogous to us, right? Like there's never just been a good, robust acknowledgement and exploration of people like Joseph and people like Yael, right? Like that woman was not, your classic idea of what womanhood should be. I mean, it takes some strength to pin a man to the floor through his head with a tent peg, like it. There's a whole world of diverse people just in those stories. And so on one hand, I'm inclined to think that the practices we already have, for Torah study and for sitting together in small circles, leaning into the stories we've been given, that we've been telling ourselves for generations, is one way to just acknowledge the human beings already among us and to learn to appreciate that it takes all of us, that there is like, like Joy is saying quite eloquently, none is above it takes every single one of us to make Jewish peoplehood. And nobody is necessarily more important than or above, but like anyone can lead Jewish service. That is not true in a lot of other traditions. Like, you cannot do that. You have to have someone has to have laid hands upon you. Instead, you are the chosen one, right? And not to say that there aren't hierarchies and sometimes disappointing and harmful processes in Jewish communities, because we live in the world we live in, but the tradition itself, the thing itself, invites and already has in it ways for us to address those barriers, if only just through the simple process of acknowledging who is with us, who is among us, who too are Jews.
Liam, I wanted to add to that from another side. I think that that's several answers to Rose's question. One is there are resources within Jewish tradition and Jewish textual tradition to draw on to remind people that it's never been, people have never been just this way or and that way, and then nobody else is really a Jew. That's absolutely true. And encouraging people to recognize one another and not just look for the ways people are the same, but to actually chill out and be able to appreciate the ways people are different. Extremely powerful um, practice, and start to think about how, I mean, in small Jewish communities, and I think maybe this is something Southern Jewish communities should be able to particularly appreciate, because a lot of them are quite small.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't have a minion if you lose one person often.
Yeah.
Speaking about appreciating, inclusiveness, when your community depends on when you realize your community depends on everyone, you find more ways to be inclusive. So all of those are good. And I just wanted to add another, which is I think that fixed identities, binary and non-binary identities, they're all ways of stabilizing the fact that as individuals, we are wildly variable.
Yes.
We don't actually, identities are acts of imagination, or we average ourselves out, or you could take them as promises. I promise to be the same person tomorrow that you see me being in front of you today. Like, human relationships really thrive on this stability. But I think one thing that Jewish communities could do, so that would help trans people and non-binary people in particular, is to have discussions of not gender in general, although that's fine also. But what I found actually when I was on one of those Sojourn events, we did a thing where invited people to tell their Jewish stories. Like, nobody is just Jewish. Everybody
Right.
has a whole story of the different ways they're Jewish. Those stories generally start with your family, whether your family was Jewish or wasn't Jewish. Well, my parents were like this and they raised me like that. And then these were key moments and I changed, and then I married this person, right? Like, your Jewishness keeps changing throughout your life. It's often conflicted or multiple. You're Jewish in multiple ways that don't really go together very well, and it splits off in different ways. And then it turns out that gender is the same. And that's normative Jewish I'm talking about. I'm not talking about any particular strange thing. Gender works the same way. One of the things that's not great about the emphasis on here's how you deal with trans and non-binary identities is it actually makes everybody else feel like there's nothing interesting or complicated or variable or dynamic about their relations to gender, which is simply not true. So what I found is the same thing happens when you invite people to tell their stories of non-trans people. Trans people do this all the time, but non-trans people who say, so tell me, starting from when you were born, what your parents' gender thing was like. How were they, men or women? How did that affect you when you were growing up? These very complicated and often quite mind-blowing stories. And I think that normalizing the telling of those stories, maybe by normalizing the telling of stories of Jewish identity, so that we can get used to this thinking of identity not as an unchanging essence, where you have the right words for it, but actually as an ongoing, messy individual story. I think that that puts all gender identities on the same playing field. It's like they're all these simplifying terms that we continue to have very different individual relations to throughout our lives. Also, folks just like telling their own stories, and they really like being listened to. And I find that they don't only like listening to me tell my transition story. They seem to feel like their own lives are important too. So it's fun for the whole family.
Indeed. I think this points to one of the questions that Rose posed to us, when we were all talking about, people being afraid to have these gender conversations because they feel politicized and
You took
controversial.
you
And
took the words right out of my mouth, Liam. That's exactly where I
I,
was about to go.
I was feeling the jam there between us, Rose, because I think it's a logical place to enter that query. And what I love about what Joy is naming rightly and eloquently relates to a practice that where I do this where this like one of the things I get paid to do, but we're going to start a circle at my temple that goes at all of this through the big questions that really are underneath all these questions we get freaked out about, like, oh, is that a man or a woman? Or what do we do with so and so who doesn't seem to be either? And why am I calling so and so they? And what, like all the things that freak people out are really at the core about what does it mean to be a human being? And so, as part of this circle process, we bring people together who make a commitment to being in that circle like once a month or once every 2 weeks for a certain period of time and talk about those very kinds of things Joy is naming, the big questions. What does it mean to be a what does it mean to be a person? How has my own sense of personhood changed and evolved over the years? What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean for me to be a Jew? What's important to me about my Jewishness? What does it mean to have fruitful relationships, right? Like what do I value about human relationships? What does it mean to die a good death? The big questions. And when you put people in a circle around a third thing, right? An objective question that seems, to be about something else. What it ends up being about is the marvelous similarities and differences, the particularities that actually end up informing what we have in common as human beings. And then, as Jews, as members of the same Winston-Salem community or the same Boston community or, wherever.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking us there and naming that, because that's something that we hear a lot at Sojourn is, oh, I don't want to even come close to touching gender diversity, a conversation about gender diversity in my congregation because it's too political, it's too divisive. But I think that it's wonderful to think about it through a lens of, everybody has something to offer that conversation. And it's not necessarily something to do with, like Joy was saying earlier, it doesn't have to be something that's disruptive to the communal experience. It can be about expanding what that communal experience looks like. So another thing we often hear at Sojourn is we hear from trans folks who say that, the gender binaries of Jewish practice, of halakha, makes it feel like there's no place for them within Judaism. And I was wondering what y'all would say to that, or what you think that Jewish communities can do to combat that.
Well, I think that there's a great precedent for Jewish communities. And actually, in some ways, the controversy over gender diversity. And some of it is controversy, but it's stuff that's unfamiliar to people, and it's changing things that are fundamental to the way we know ourselves and one another. I don't mean to minimize that. That is something people should talk and think about. And then there's the ginned up controversy stuff about it. But the precedent for it, and it really isn't that long ago, is Jewish feminism. It really was a few decades ago. Jewish congregations freaked out when all these women started saying, we're actually people also. And all of the bylaws, probably every single set of bylaws in every synagogue in America, only use the word men. The president of the congregation, he, you know, it was without question that, of course, the the tradition was written, not the binary wasn't the problem. The problem was the binary was they only had one fully functional member in it, right? So none of that was, I mean, some of that is coming out of halakha. Halakha has the Talmud has a special tractate called Women. There's no tractate called Men, right? So women are the special, unusual case, right? And men are just the universal norm. So there's a long, not proud history in Jewish tradition of this. But Jewish feminists basically made such a problem about this. It's like, why does this matter to you? Why do these pronouns and these words matter to you so much? Why do you have to come up to the bima? And why, right? All this kind of stuff. So many congregations, they just degendered their bylaws. They took gender out of the bylaws. Some congregations, still do the, men and women thing, but for a lot of, rabbis, it's just you try to not to address your community in gender terms, because the chances that you're going to tick somebody off, a woman, that you're going to tick a woman off, ladies and gentlemen, the gentlemen don't usually mind, but some of the ladies almost always do, right? So this kind of touchiness over what language is used, what pronouns, are used, who is recognized, who isn't recognized. A lot of congregations went through this in relation to women, and they realized that things will be much easier for everyone. We're not going to change our sexist attitudes. There's plenty of institutionalized misogyny in Jewish communities, but we can change the bylaws and practices. We can just take gender out of it. And that means we have a lot fewer fights over gender. So there's more space in Jewish, even in pretty binary Jewish communities, for trans and non-binary people than there used to be, just because of that action by Jewish feminism and the responses to it. And there is a tradition of change to draw on. And, basically there is not much that you can't change in Jewish practice in terms of gender. The problem comes, and this was very early in my transition. I was at one of the first queer synagogues, and which at that point really meant lesbian and gay synagogue, and they had some trans and non-binary people. We were literally meeting in the basement, the trans and non-binary people. And they said, yeah, nobody here really gets what's going on with us. And I said, well, let's just do an experiment. Imagine that right now we can change the role of gender in Judaism, traditional Judaism, any way that we want to. What do you want to do? Do you want to just eliminate all binary gender? How do you want to change it? And nobody wanted to eliminate binary gender. They said it's very beautiful. Some of the gendering of commandments, it binds generations together. Mothers and daughters with candle lighting, and fathers and sons with a whole bunch of stuff. But they thought this was a good aspect of Judaism and Jewish tradition. They wanted to add to it. They didn't want to take away from it. And I think that, so I said, on the one hand, you can solve a lot of problems by taking stuff away. But I would say the other problems we can try to come at by adding and expanding the richness of Jewish tradition. And we have a lot of precedent for both. So I would say it's not true that there's no room in Jewish tradition because it's so binary. There's no room in Judaism. I would just say there are a lot of communities have done different amounts of work on this. But this work has been done. There are models to follow. We don't have to ask ourselves, oh, can this ever happen? Will we lose Judaism? It can be done. Judaism comes out just fine and better than ever, really.
Yeah. So, Joy, that makes me think about, particularly in Reform congregations. I know we're not the only ones, but this tradition too of Hebrew school, right? And the idea of bat mitzvah now, which leads to adult classes, right? And so at our temple, we don't gender it. We call it brit mitzvah, covenant. So our class is predominantly women, as you might imagine, right? Of a certain age, because they were not able to have bat mitzvah, right? And the vast majority of them cannot read or write Hebrew. And so they come in with all these questions. There's like 13 of us in this class, and me and another convert are the only, male blending or male-ish people in the room among all these women, which I am thoroughly enjoying, actually, but because of the very questions you're talking about and their unawareness even of how Jewish feminism has impacted even our practice, that they can be there, and that some of their questions are being answered simply by teaching Hebrew. Like the process of understanding that Hebrew, like French and Spanish and a whole world of languages, just is gendered, that it's how the linguistics of the language function, has been like you can see people going, oh, well, so that doesn't mean God is a he, and therefore anyone not a he is less than me, or less than God, or, less than one another. Oh, you mean we don't have to think about it this way? And so, what I think is beautiful about what you've lifted up is, again, the tradition and the precedent and the practice are embedded in what we already have. And it makes me think of Neusner and others who've talked about the thing that has allowed Judaism to survive all these centuries has been its ability to both hold tradition, hold some sense of collective identity, and to expand and grow that and elaborate it and change it as needed for the world that the Jews at the time were living in. And there's absolutely no reason why we cannot do the same amid even a text that gives us people like Yael and all these other characters who are at least gender nonconforming in some ways, and some of whom are just curious, wonderfully weird individuals, which, gives us a place to say, look, we don't have to all be the same. And in fact, probably we're not supposed to be.
I just really wanted to say that I love what you said about Hebrew, which is a pain in the butt for a lot of trans and non-binary people, the genderedness of Hebrew. When my daughter was bat mitzvah, there was a question about how to refer to me after transition. And, like it would just be better to not have that. And English has a lot less of it. Some languages don't have it at all. But what Liam is reminding us is that when you look at Hebrew, you've got gender doesn't actually mean human gender. Like the fact that everything in Hebrew has a gender, the bridge has a gender. Well, what the heck does the bridges, what does that mean? The stone has a gender. Some things have genders, and you're like, wow, that is just the exact opposite of the gender I would have imagined you would give that. It's a pure linguistic convention, which enables you to see the arbitrariness of the maleness and female. I love that a woman in your class was like, oh, wow, that means God's gender is just a way of talking. I mean, that is a pretty revolutionary thing. Well, once you realize gendering God is a way of talking, I don't think it's that much of a leap to say, oh, the way I gender people is a way of talking also. Like I can change my way of talking without having my reality melt down.
Exactly. And I mean, yes, yes.
And I really liked what you were saying about being additive instead of restrictive, and about, something that I love about Judaism is that words are incredibly powerful, and that there's a lot of, Jewish teaching and deep meaning about how powerful words are. But then at the same time, that doesn't mean that the wrong words, like you said, will make your reality melt down. It means that there's, sort of infinite possibility in those. So
Indeed.
as we wrap up here, the last question I have for y'all, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions from folks in the room, is that I know that y'all are both well practiced in having, courageous conversations, brave space conversations that might be difficult for folks. And I was wondering what you think that Torah and Judaism can teach us about, the pitfalls of tolerance and how to move towards celebration and belonging. This is sort of the general theme of the whole chat, but if there's other things on that note that you want to say or bring up or raise.
The Torah, I think, is mixed in terms of being a model for this. The Torah does more acknowledging of diversity than celebrating of diversity. For example, people often forget that, like next week or the week after in the Parsha, when the Israelites go out of Egypt. So that Egypt is where Jews first become a nation, a distinct ethnicity as opposed to a family. But when they leave, a whole bunch of other people leave with them. Lots of other people are like, oh, it's time to get out of Egypt. We can get out of Egypt. That's cool. I'm not really sure what the appeal of walking into the desert is if you're not an Israelite, but whatever it is, it was a lot of people. And so on the one hand, there is no moment in Jewish history where Jews are homogenous.
Yeah.
Even when they're listing in the people who go down into Egypt, when it's just Jacob's family, one of them is listed as Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. And, there's always, it's not pure blood. It's not ethnically or nationally or experientially pure at any point in Jewish history. It's always a mix. And the Torah is kind of sometimes tolerates the mixed multitude. It keeps referring to them as the mixed multitude, which is not like a great thing, right? So who's mixed into that multitude? That's, just saying a bunch of people who are different does not show to me an appreciation of diversity and individuality the way Liam was talking about. It's and they're blamed for stuff. Oh, these problems were caused by the grumbling of the mixed multitude kind of stuff. So there's an acknowledgement of that it takes many kinds of people, including non-Jews, to make up a Jewish community right from the beginning, always. And there's always motion into that community, right? There's even before they leave Egypt, God is making provision for non-Jews who live in the community to celebrate Passover, which is the ultimate ritual of Jewish identity. Like they're literally walking out of Egypt, and God says to Moses and Aaron, by the way, when you're celebrating Passover next time in the land of Canaan, make sure that you make provision for the people who are not Jews, but who dwell among you. And as long as they're circumcised, you have to make sure that they can offer the sacrifice too. So from God's point of view, people who seem like strangers, but are actually part of your community. And God's like, I know you're going to see them as strangers, but I'm expecting them to show up there. I'm expecting them to be treated equally and to be respected. And yet that word stranger is not quite what we're looking for in terms of our models of gender diversity. That is more like tolerance from a human perspective. So I do think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think the thing that really goes beyond tolerance, and Liam has referred to this a few times, is the idea of Klal Yisrael. And the people who really exemplify this, they're the Chabad mitzvah mobile people. They're
Yeah.
like, Jewish female ancestor, like, we're going to count you as Jewish if we can count you as Jewish. And if we can count you as Jewish, we want you to do a mitzvah. Whatever other problems you have, a lot of times trans Jews who are Orthodox will advise other people who are in transition. They say, go to a Chabad service because they want to include everybody.
Yeah.
That's really like radical inclusion, the idea that every Jewish soul is too precious to leave out of Jewish community. That's more than tolerance, even though it doesn't actually address any of the problems of difference. It just says, we're going to suspend that because the most important thing is, are you Jewish in some way? You can deal with the problems of are you Jewish at another point time, but yeah, I think that is what communities should be shooting for, that every single soul in their community should be seen as part of the whole and valued as part of the whole. If they're not there, your community is not whole. They may be a pain in the butt, and you don't have to be trans or non-binary to be a problem for a community. Like, having community is being with people who are irritating, who take up too much space. I mean, it's, like, communities complain about each other, right? It's not all one happy family, but you need those people. You miss them. You miss them when they leave. You miss them when they die. You know, that's what inclusion really should be.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm thinking again about poor little old Joseph and his getting tossed in the pit, right? Because really, his brothers tolerated him and all his weirdness until they couldn't tolerate him anymore. Until he was prancing around in all his, princess dress glory, and they had to toss him in the pit. Well, clearly, we know that's the tolerance left untended by relationality and heart leads to tossing people in the pit, whether it's the guy with Tourette's in the third row, or the non-binary person who never dresses the same way twice on Shabbat and freaks out some of the people around it. What the people who just got to take up a ton of space, the people who always have an opinion about everything, all the people who grind our gears, right? Like, if we don't meet it, tolerance left untended by relational curiosity and compassion leads to throwing people in the ditch, metaphorically and sometimes literally. And so I think, for me, the image, because there's folks who grind my gears, right? Like, I have to stretch to see them as beautiful creatures, or perhaps even unusually beautiful creatures. But I'm striving to do that because that's how I want people to see me. And the other thing I think about is families, right? Again, there are folks in our own families who, we're not crazy about sitting down for the holiday meal with, but we do it. Or, and I'm not saying we should acclimate ourselves to or accept, abusive or toxic relationships. But what I am saying is that I think Judaism is rife with examples of how we move from just, being in proximity to one another or tolerating one another to something more resembling of God coming to us in the garden. Like when Joseph figures out who his brothers are, and he's the person able to save the family from starvation, right? And there's this reconciliation that is possible because of, compassion, heart, and relationality. These stories abound. And I just think that the tools for us to learn to embrace difference in our congregations, including people like me, is in the Torah itself and in the practices that we have before us. The practice of Shabbat is all about welcoming. If we turn to welcome Shekinah, we should turn to welcome one another.
Really, really well said. Thank you both. Wow. And Lisa is in the chat saying the exact same thing I just said. We've got a tiny, tiny bit of time left, but I did want to ask if anybody in the room with us had any final questions or anything that you're wondering or want to hear Liam or Joy pontificate on. Thank you, Joyce.
I just want to say thank you so much to Liam and Joy. Like, such an interesting conversation. I feel like I don't want to leave it. We could go on for months. There's so much. And you know what? That is what is so beautiful about Judaism. It is such a huge living, breathing thing that has so many options and discussions and intellectual conversations. And that is what I've always loved about Judaism, is that it's holy to question, that we should question, and that it should always be like this living, breathing, moving thing. And this was such a great conversation, and appreciate both of your thoughts and contributions so much, and giving me so much to think about. And thank you, Joy, for lifting up the feminist movement in Judaism. Because I really relate to that, and I've never related it to this larger gender question, which I really should have. But I grew up in a conservative synagogue, and I was the first one to fulfill traditionally male commandments in my synagogue. And there was a lot of pushback, a ton. And I chant Torah and all of that. And I got, just a lot of pushback from the very male dominated, as you know, and it's just so interesting. I never connected that powerful movement of the feminists to current day gender, non-binary, all the beautiful array of folks. I never connected that, and that's such an interesting thought process, because you're right, it all does exist, and we all get to choose.
Mm-hmm.
Those things. It does exist. I did not think about this. This has given me such a new way to think about it. So thank you so much. And just that we all can choose what we want to do in our beautiful religion.
Thank you,
So
Lisa.
Thank you guys so much.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.